Just a quick heads up before you listen to this podcast. This was not originally slated to be a podcast on one of my shows. Rabbi Garfield, Rabbi Yerachmiel Garfield, he's the head of school of our school here in Houston, and he has a podcast of his own called Chinuch Today. The word Chinuch is the Hebrew word for education, and it's a podcast about education, where he speaks to experts about education and schools and classroom management and curriculum management. Truth is, I haven't really listened to any of them, so I don't know what he really talks about. But we chatted a bit before he launched his podcast, and apparently he's doing really well. And he reached out to me and my brother if we would be interested in being interviewed about what it's like to grow up as a Wolbe, because my grandfather was a very famous and influential rabbi and also a very famous and influential educator, a pedagogue. So he wanted to speak to us about what it was like to grow up as a Wolbe and what are some of the lessons, some of the stories about my grandfather, a blessed memory, of our grandfather, a blessed memory. And we agreed to be interviewed. And a couple of days ago at the Torat Center in Houston, Texas, we had the interview, we had the recording. And when it was done, I asked him if he would mind if I actually cross-post it on my show, and that's what you're about to listen to. But I have to make a quick disclaimer before you listen. I pride myself, whenever I speak on my shows, to always speak in English, and thus to not use any specialized lingo or any Hebrew words or any Yiddish words or anything that will not be understood by someone who is proficient in English, because I want to make my content accessible. The Chinuch Today podcast that we were interviewed for, that is targeting to a more niche audience. It's really to Jewish education professionals who have a very strong background in Jewish learning, and thus the lingo, the way of communicating is a bit more specialized, and there's going to be a lot more Hebrew than what you are accustomed to hearing on our shows. So there will be some words and some citations and some phrases and some statements that may not make sense to you. If that's too much for you, that's okay. But I thought it would be a valuable listen for you nonetheless. We had a great rollicking time, and we told all sorts of stories, and I may have pontificated a bit, but I have a weakness for that. I may have grabbed the microphone a bit too aggressively. Listen, no one is perfect, but it was enjoyable to record. I hope it is enjoyable to listen, and hope you get something positive out of it. And of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Chinuch Today. Another first for Chinuch Today. I've never had two brothers together, and I've never reached out to a queue of professionals to get their perspective on Chinuch, but you will hear there's something very special about this dynamic duo. I'm here with Rabbi Aryeh Wolbe, the executive director of Torch, and his somewhat younger brother, Rabbi Yaakov Wolbe, the director of global outreach at Torch. Good morning.
Hey.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thanks for being here. So I always wondered what it would be like to grow up with a famous name. My last name is Garfield. I am famous for that, I must say. It is somewhat memorable, but it's not Wolbe. And I remember when I first came to Houston, and I had first one Wolbe and then two Wolbes, and then I had two Shlomo Wolbes in my school. It always felt a little funny, how do you discipline a kid whose name is Shlomo Wolbe? Lucky for me, that's never been relevant for your children, so I didn't have to experience that. But nonetheless,
well, Garfield is a comic. That was hysterical.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's what I go by. And every once in a while, I meet someone who claims they never heard of it, which is always fascinating to me. Really? Anyway, also a president, and do you know what the third famous Garfield is?
Garfield is a president.
John Garfield was an actor, some kind of actor in the 40s or 50s. So
President Garfield was assassinated, though.
That is true. We don't focus on that aspect of his presidency, but yes, indeed. We're not related at all. Our name was some Yiddish version of something that turned into Garfield. Nonetheless, I'm happy you guys are here. And as I mentioned, the name Wolbe being so famous because of your esteemed grandfather of Shlomo Wolbe, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. And I thought he is known as the Mechanech Hador, the exceptional Mechanech educator of our time. And what an opportunity it is to talk about that a little and see what lessons we could learn and share with our audience about that great lineage. So as I always like to do is find out a little about you. I think we'll start with Aryeh because you were born first. Where'd you guys grow up?
So I was born in Yerushalayim, raised in New York, and in Brooklyn, New York, and then we moved to Monsey when I was 10 years old. Just to go back on your introduction of what it means to grow up with such a name.
Yeah.
So till I was about 15 years old, it was fabulous. But when I was 15, I moved to Eretz Yisrael on my own, and I went to an Israeli yeshiva, and I saw the like they have two tiers of law enforcement. Like some people they want to go after, so they get them, and some people they just ignore, let them go. I had that in yeshiva, where like if everyone did something, it was fine because we don't expect Goldstein and Goldberg. We don't. Wolbe.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you're going to be accountant. And there was a point where I came to my father and I said, I want to not only leave this yeshiva, I want to leave this yeshiva and change my name before I go to a different yeshiva.
Really?
Yeah. I was so fed up with being held to a certain standard. That was unfair. I'm still a 15-year-old boy. Give me, cut me some slack. And Baruch Hashem, I try and I do everything I can for my son, whose namesake is my grandfather, to not pressure him to do anything that's not him. You be you. My grandfather was a great man. He was a special person, and he did whatever he could to be the greatest he can be. You be the greatest you can be, but you don't have to be him.
Wow, that's such a good message. And I think as the person being mechanech, your son, and to all the mechanechim listening who might be in a similar situation, that's a great sensitivity. Not to say to a kid, hey, you're Shlomo Wolbe, like, what are you doing? That would be really hurtful.
I'll tell you, many times over the years, I've had people say Shalom Aleichem, oh, what's your name, this and that, and then like, what did you say? What was your name? I said, Aryeh Wolbe, and they'd stand up, and like, oh, an Einikl from the Mashgiach, and it's like, no, I'm still me. Nothing changed. You know what I mean? It's like, it's people. And for my son, I've seen it numerous times where people would say Shalom Aleichem to him and say, you're Shlomo Wolbe. Oh, like, wow, that's a big name to live up to. And I would always turn to my son and say, like, don't think that you have to be Saba. You're not Saba. You're you.
Isn't there another side to this? Don't we walk around with pride that we're Bnei Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we have to live up to a higher standard? I know we have some relatives who are Kohanim, and I always hear them say, like, you're a Kohen. You have to live up to that. The Gemara tells a story about the son and daughter of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, the last Kohen Gadol that we had, and they were taken captive by the Romans, and they were kind of prepositioned to do something really bad unwittingly. And they said, they marshaled their fortitude and the tenacity to overcome, because I am a scion of Aaron HaKohen, of Aaron the high priest. You have a yeshivish audience. I could use.
You could use Hebrew, yes.
I could use Hebrew. There's something to be said about knowing that you come from special stock. You don't come from ordinary stock. Of course, no Jew is ordinary. I know that. But if you come from Tarshishe Olam, right? Mideza Tarshishim, you come from giants. You emanate from some of the great legends of our time. You should maybe lift up to that standard, because you do have that greatness and that potential maybe coursing within you.
100%. But when you have a young child who doesn't understand that, and you try to put the pressure of a Gadol Hadar, that's not fair. And then they won't even make it to first base. So 100%.
I remember, I'll tell you a cool story. Never said on the podcast. Not this one and not mine.
Now with Chinuch Today. Breaking news.
So when I was in high school, we had our Masifta, our high school, was located on the campus of Ar Sameach in Monsey. And the dean of Ar Sameach was Rabbi Garfield, who was a student of my grandfather. And I was a rambunctious high school boy, and I would walk around and stomp around and run through the halls in a way fitting maybe of kids, right? But I remember once I was marching through the halls of Ar Sameach, and I was either being very loud or a bit obnoxious or something like that. I remember I kind of turned the corner, and there's Rabbi Garfield, and he's like a kind of a scary, imposing person. And I didn't see him. It came from the other side. I remember he took me like this around the shoulder, and he grabbed me on the shoulder. And he's like, "Do you know who you come from?" And he started speaking not about my grandfather, but my great-grandfather, the great Rav Avram Grudzinski, the greatest Talmud, greatest Talmud of the Alter. According to Rabbi Yaakov, the greatest Talmud. This is my portion with all my toil, is Rav Avram Grudzinski. That's what the Alter said about him. And he started speaking about him, and I found it to be a very formative memory for me to know where you come from, know who your ancestors are, know how great they became, and that DNA courses within your veins. You have the capacity to do that as well.
Did you experience any of the negativity?
Of course. Me, it was more, it didn't cause me to want to change my name. Other stuff did, maybe. But
the FBI will find you, Yaakov.
No, not that. But the people always say, like in a mocking, sardonic way, it's not fitting. What would your grandfather say? Anything that they disagreed with, they just kind of channeled it. Would your grandfather approve of that? What does he say about that? When the Rebbe in Yeshiva Gedola, when he encountered me on the bus without wearing a hat, the Yeshiva guy's supposed to wear a hat. Mm-hmm. He's like, so with me and a friend of mine, Yishai. He doesn't listen to podcasts because he doesn't speak English. So he gave us a whole speech on the bus about the importance of a yeshiva student wearing the yeshiva garb, nice black hat, nice jacket. And he was speaking to him about it and speaking to him. And then he says, and to you, just look at what your grandfather says about that. So there's a lot of that, but mostly in good nature. And yeah, there is a certain kind of expectation that other people have for you, and you're born ignorant, and you're born with nothing, and you're totally oblivious to everything. And there's a certain bar that people, a certain standard that people have for you, baked into, your namesake and where you come from. And yeah, there is some downside to that, but maybe that's a good thing. I remember once, I was davening Shacharis in a shtibel in Yerushalayim. So this is like a minion factory, right? So they have a minion anywhere from 5 to 5, right? At 12 o'clock you can find a minion. So I was like a late minion. It was like after 10, when all the responsible people are already a few hours into their day. And the laggards are putting on their tefillin. So I remember someone coming and reading my tefillin back. And he's like, what are you doing here with a name like that? You have no business being here. So again, there are some these little things that where people, like my brother says, they hold you to a certain higher standard, but that's okay. I guess it comes to the territory. Maybe it's a downside, but maybe it's a good side. Maybe it's a good thing to know that you come from higher stock, whether it's true or not.
I'm sure Ari would agree that there are some benefits to it as well. So,
of course, I loved every minute of being together with my grandfather. I want to tell you an amazing story about Chinuch that is not a secret, but so you don't have to do one of those breaking announcements.
Breaking announcement.
I woke up in Yeshiva one morning. I was in Oral Chon in Yeshiva Ktana, which is on Rehov El Kabetz in Givat Shaul. And, regular wake up is at 7 o'clock. And the guy comes storming into my room. He says, your grandfather's here. Your grandfather's here. So regular, ordinary day. So quickly get dressed like I would every morning and get upstairs into the Beis Medrash to daven. And my grandfather's sitting right next to my seat with his talis and tefillin on. And with no announcements, no nothing, he just came to daven right next to me. And we davened the whole davening. Didn't say a word, nothing. On the way out, I was helping my grandfather, it's nice to see you here, and that's it. And I walked out with him. I walked him to his house. I had breakfast with him like I had many times. And that was it. I was always wondering, why did he show up in yeshiva? Ma pitom, and to me, it's obvious. I was dealing with a lot in that, it was a total culture shock for me. I moved from New York to Eretz Yisrael myself without my parents there. And I went to it. It's in an Ivy League yeshiva. It's the best of the best go there. I only went there not because I was the right fit for the yeshiva, but because my grandfather's Talmud was the Rosh Yeshiva. So he called him up. He said, my grandson is coming from America. Can you take him into the yeshiva? He was like, oh, of course, no problem. But I couldn't read a Gemara. I couldn't read a pasuk. Nothing. And I remember seeing these Bachurim in the Yeshiva reading Gemara like it was a New York Times, newspaper. They were just like, and I was, no, but they were pounding daf after daf after daf, mesechtas after mesechtas, and I'm struggling reading Arba Avos Nezikin. Like reading, never mind understanding. And it was a point where my brother told me my parents were so concerned that I was just going to drop out of yeshiva. Baruch Hashem, that wasn't on my mind, and I was in for the fight. And it was the most incredible time of my life because I had to punch way over my weight, and eventually got to the point where I was hopefully up to par with the rest of the guys. It took a year and a half, but it was a tremendous struggle. My grandfather sensed it. See, he's like, what can I do to give him chizuk? What is he going to talk to my rabbeim? Like what? It's like I hardly spoke the language when I got there.
Wow.
But he could come sit and daven next to me and give me that feeling. And he knew his weight of what he carried and the covet that it would bring to me and the infusion of positivity that it would bring to me, that all the bachrim like, wow, like a gadol came to daven in our shul, in our yeshiva, and walking out with him, holding his tefillin bag. It was like the whole thing, it's like just to build me up.
Beautiful.
And I want to add another point. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said in this area, the benefits, so to speak, of growing up with a famous grandfather and a famous last name. I know for certain that our grandfather davened, prayed for our well-being and our success. I know that for certain. And sometimes I kind of, pinch myself and say, like, how did we do this? How did my father, like the family he built is just unbelievable. Parents, like just the family that they have and the kids and the success that they're seeing with their progeny. It's really unusual. It's unusual. And I know the answer. The answer comes from his prayer and the righteousness of our illustrious antecedents. That's playing out in our lives as well. And I believe that wholeheartedly. We have the big guns fighting on our behalf.
Beautiful.
That's the feel of the parents. I will tell you an amazing story. My brother and I asked my grandfather, what's the secret to your greatness? Like how did you get there? And he said that although he grew up in a non-religious home, for those of you who are listening now and didn't know that, it's a big shocker to many people. Like, what? He grew up non from home. He said that every morning...
Marginally religious.
Perhaps.
Not a Haredi home.
Definitely not. He said that his mother, every morning when she would tie his shoes, would whisper in his ear, go be a Talmud Chacham, go learn Torah, go be a Yoreh Shamayim. And he says that those tefillas are the tefillas that helped him succeed.
Wow.
I will tell you that I did hear from Rav Hamnik, who was the mashgiach of my grandfather's favorite yeshiva, Yad Aaron, which all of us,
except for
all seven of us besides for Arya, we all went to this yeshiva. So he told us that when I was in the yeshiva, I was with my older brother Yoni. He was there at that time. We overlapped. Yoni was there for the duration. He was there for 7-8 years. I couldn't handle more than a year and change. But he went to my grandfather and he said, the boys are doing so well. He might have embellished that, shall we say. Boys are doing so well. So Saba says, my grandfather said, it's the schus of the Chazon Ish. It's the merit of the Chazon Ish, because my father's sandik was the Chazon Ish. So he said, he pinned all the success, so to speak, on the Chazon Ish. And Rav Hamnet says, well, what about you? You kind of downplayed that. But again, I know for certain that he prayed intensively on our behalf. And,
as did our mother.
Of course. And you enjoy those fruits, the forefather, Jacob.
Yaakov, for those who are listening.
Yeah. He described tefillah, prayer, as shooting an arrow. B'charbi u'b'kashti. He says he won a war with the sword and his bow. Sword to Rashi, that's Talmud Torah. This is the final verse of chapter 48 of Genesis. Parak Mem Ches. beginning of Parshas Vayechi. He won a war with a sword and a bow with Torah and Tefillah. Tefillah is a bow. It travels great distance. And tefillos, like the tefillos of Avraham Avinu, we still go back to them because they're still efficacious even now. So I really feel like that is some real ammunition that we have helping us thanks to our very illustrious, meritorious, pious antecedents.
Do you know what it was about Yad Aaron that he found so special, that yeshiva?
I think there are a number of components. I think firstly is that it was a smaller yeshiva, and it was a yeshiva that was focused on the Talmidim. There was a very close relationship with the Talmidim between the Rabbeim and the Talmidim. Many of the yeshivas are too big and too understaffed to handle and really be mechanech. It means many yeshivas are just a yeshiva because it's a yeshiva. You come to learn and finished. But they don't feel the sense of achrayus to be mechanech. Even in Koil, just because a guy's married doesn't mean that he doesn't need chinuch. And I feel that it's a tremendous flaw in many of the Koilim that you're there, you come, you learn, you get paid if you get paid, and go home. But there's no relationship of chinuch with the hanhala, which is, I think, a flaw.
Yeah, listen, my grandfather would lament this more than anything else, the fact that there's generations, in his words, generations of very serious yeshiva students that are growing up without any chinuch, to use his words. That's what he says. There's no chinuch. And we spoke about this before we started recording, about the Alter of Slobodka, which is the greatest pedagogue of all time. He was reprimanded by his teacher, who was the Alter of Kelm, because he had too many students. Because there are 300 students. In Kelm, there were 40 students. That's it. The whole Talmud Torah of Kelm, 40 students. And he said to him, how could you be mechanech when you have 300 students? You're not raising Talmidim, you're raising hats, he told him. And my grandfather said about himself that he matches out, I think I heard different accounts, either at 60 students or at 100 students. He could be responsible for the flourishing of between either 60 or 100 students, or 99. He wanted to keep it less than 100. And then my uncle, he should live and be well. My grandfather's hand-selected son-in-law, Rav Erlander, was the Mashgiach in the Mir in Flatbush. He said, well, if Saba could handle 60 Talmidim, I could handle 30. But the point is that you have yeshivas today. Someone told me this recently. There are more than 15 yeshivas in Israel with more than 1,000 students.
Wow. How
could you possibly know? How could the Mashgiach or the Rashiva or the Bechanach, whatever, how could they know what someone is, what 1,000 guys are going through? 1,000 guys are going through. My Rabbi used to talk about Rabbi Yerucham, the legendary Rabbi Yerucham, when he came back to the Mir Yeshiva after World War I. And there were 300 Bachim there in the yeshiva. So he was the head of the yeshiva. He was the mashgiach, but he was, functionally the head of the yeshiva before the war. After the war, the yeshiva was fragmented, it scattered. He came back. After 3 months, Rabbi Yerucham said, I know the qualities of every single Bachar in this yeshiva, 300 Bachrim. And most of them, they're flaws as well. That's a real mechanech, to actually know, to have a sense of the spiritual physiology, the spiritual makeup of your Talmidim, and to know how to guide them, how to direct them. What's his derech? How do you know? So a real pedagogue, a real mechanech, is someone who's able to really understand the tchunas nefesh, the qualities, the shorosh neshama, the essence of their Talmidim, and Rabbi Yerucham was the master of that. Yad Aaron is a vestige of those yeshivas of the past. That kind of chinuch, sadly, is basically extinct. That's why my grandfather wrote Alei Shur, Volume 2. It's a self-serve form of chinuch, form of adracha. That's what he writes. He says it doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to preserve this way of training. That way it can be a self-serve guide for people growing up in a world without any chinuch.
Beautiful. I believe the Baal Tanya says the same thing about the Tanya, why he wrote it. It was because he wanted to make it a self-study for people who want an initiation into Hasidus. So it's a precedent for that.
So you're probably wondering why I didn't go to that yeshiva. So one of the Rabbeim, Rav Beryl Eisenstein, Zechet Tzadik Levracha, the year before I was going to Yeshiva G'dayla, which I was going to go to Yad Aaron, he left the yeshiva and opened his own yeshiva. And my grandfather thought it was best that I go to learn by him because he was in Yad Aaron. And he left Yad Aaron, started his own yeshiva. And I was very, very, very close with him. Very close. For years, till he was nifter. And an interesting thing about always having a Rebbe, a mechanach, someone to look after your spiritual well-being. A few days before he was nifter, obviously unbeknownst to me that he was going to pass away a few days later, I was walking with my brother Yoni, and we were walking down Panimi Rot, Sorotskin, where I lived and where my Rebbe lived. And we were passing by his house Friday night. And we're like, you know what, let's just go and say good Shabbos to Rebbe. I went in. I knew he wasn't feeling well, but I didn't know that he was deathly ill. And he was slumped over his Gemara. And I asked him, Rebbe, how you doing? How are things going? So he says to me, like in a confusion, like, where are you learning now? I was in Koil by Rabbi Berkowitz, Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz. And he says, oh, he's a Yashar. Make him your Rebbe. And I said, Rebbe, are you going someplace? And sadly, 3 days later, he was nifter.
Wow. And
I went from the Levaya, I went straight to Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz, and I said, Shalom Aleichem Rebbe, Rebbe Omeiri. And I said, you know, if you're going to be my Rebbe, I need to have quality time so you get to know me, and that we can, and we spent a significant amount of time every week together learning B'chavrusa, the teachings of my great-grandfather, Avram Grodzinski, one of his favorites, Faram Teres Avram. And in the process, he got to know me very, very well. And till this very day, I learn with Rabbi Berkowitz. I talk to him every week.
Wow.
And there are many times I'll ask him for guidance, counsel, which is only appropriate based on knowing who I am. And there are times where he'll say, I know you, and either do this or don't do this, based on what he knows about me.
Do you think it's realistic on a macro level for everyone to have a relationship like that with a Rebbe?
Maybe not with the same person, but I'm sure there are plenty of rabbis out there who are, I hope, that are qualified to get to know their Talmidim well enough to give them guidance and counsel.
I do think this is a two-sided problem. I would agree to your point that there's a dearth of people who want Rabbeim on one side, but there's also a dearth of people that are willing to give themselves over to their Talmidim, to their students,
right.
to their
charges. The way you're describing it, it's quite a serious commitment on Rabbi Berkowitz's.
On both sides.
Yeah.
On both sides.
Look, you have to pursue it. You have to pursue it, and it's not going to come easy. And I literally drove him crazy until he gave me the time. I would be waiting outside his office. Every time that door opened, I'm like, does Rebbe have a minute? And in mamish nudging him till he gave in. And he relented. And guys think it's just going to be like, oh, I'll set up, I'll ask him. Oh, he said he doesn't have time. And so I guess it's just not going to happen. Right. If you're not going to fight for it, if it's not important enough for you to really, really pursue it, it's not going to happen. No rabbi's calling his Talmud saying, hey, you didn't call me today. Why didn't you call me for advice? He's a very busy person. I have to fight for his time because it's very valuable to me.
It's only got harder over the years, right?
And Baruch Hashem, every time I've made the attempt to reach Rebbe, I was able to. Wow. He knows it's important. I'm not driving him nuts. I'm not asking him about the score of the Astros. Right. I'm asking him important things that are either relevant to me personally, to my family, to the Kehillah, to the organization, to students, to Klal Yisrael. So, it's dealing with a lot of different things, and he knows I'm not wasting his time. There are times we have a set a lot of time. There are times where I only have 5 minutes of questions, not 15 minutes. I say, Rebbe, I'm done. Your time is precious. I'm not going to just schmooze for the next 10 minutes because I have this time. I know your time is important to you and to Klal Yisrael. So,
Nice. I don't know if you guys know, but I learned let me say that again. I was lucky enough to learn in Givat Shaul, near your grandfather's house, and got to interact with him all those years. I was there in 94 to 98. Preshburg, and then he opened the yeshiva down the block on top of Birkat Rachel. I used to go Friday night to Shmuzin, and I got to speak to him a few times. And one of the things that really stands out in my mind is the way he held himself, the way he would carry himself. Extremely distinguished and disciplined. You got the sense that he took life seriously, and he almost took every move seriously. Like, that was the impression I got at that time. And I'm curious, as a grandfather, growing up with him, did he have two modes? Was he more playful? Was there a side of him that we didn't get to see? What was he like behind the doors of his apartment?
Well, you're describing him, I think, very accurately, that he was very measured. And this is actually one of the hallmarks of all the Bali Musar, is that they would not move unless it was calculated. The aforementioned Altar of Kelm My grandfather writes this. I could show you the citation later. I'd have a lot of citations I need to show you. He says, my grandfather says about him, his eyes never moved. His eyes never moved. If he wanted to see something to the side, he would move his whole head. His eyes were laser focused right in the middle, and he would move his whole head. And, Rabbi Yerucham used to always speak about Kovid Rosh, about having a certain, gravity where you're not just, a yo-yo, gyrating to every whim of the Yetzer Hara. You're in control. I would say the essence of Musar is self-control, where your higher intelligence, your das, is determining your behavior, not just, you hear a noise, back and forth, what do you think? I need this, I want that, and you drink it. No. You're in charge. You're kind of your higher self. You're overconscious, not unconscious. The neshama really is determining your behavior. That's the Bali Musar in general. But he definitely had a very, very playful persona. And he was so sweet, so funny.
Great sense of humor.
Yeah, hysterical.
Great sense of humor.
Really?
But I'll put it into perspective in a second. Like, we never talked about sports cars and baseball or any sports, and that was not in the realm of Kedusha, in the realm of holiness, in the realm of family things that he was involved with. But you couldn't have just a conversation about just worldly things. It wasn't, you didn't talk politics with him. It wasn't, no schmooze like small talk. But I will tell you an example that my grandfather gave many, many times about Kalus Rosh, is like people swing their head without even thinking about what they're doing. He would say, so right now, I remember this is in a Chumash shir that he was giving in Givat Shaul. He's saying, if someone walked into the door now, into the room, how many people would turn their head to look who it is? What does it make a difference who it is? But if someone behind you says Kaddish, everybody turns around. It's because there's no kvedus rosh. There's no, why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm about to do, and to think about it before you do it. My grandfather, we would have a vad with my grandfather of all the grandchildren the day before the Zman. We did this many, many times. My grandfather repeated the same thing over and over again. And what he would say was, you need to work to overcome your impulse 3 to 5 times a day. What does that mean? You have an impulse. Right now, I want to leave the base medrash and go get a drink. You know what? I'm going to do it in 3 minutes. Just to have control, self-control, 3 to 5 times a day, intentionally, to overcome your impulse.
Wow.
And the benefit of that is, number one, is you get that kvedus rosh of, you don't just do things. You think about it before you do it. But also, it helps you in a very practical way. If you're about to get angry, but you're trained to overcome your impulse, you can overcome that anger because of it. And it's the same thing with every media you can think of. It's because you're thinking before you're doing.
Well, he writes that that's what das is. Das is a hard word to translate, but it is described as the alpha characteristic. Because with that, you can acquire everything. Like the Gemara says, the Talmud says that with one characteristic, you can get everything. Well, what's that? It's das. It's the capacity to, they made a famous song out of it. Yassid Green.
Mm-hmm.
Did the Beit Kula Bay. Whoever has das, you have everything. If you don't have das, you have nothing.
I think I read Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said that his main focus was das atzmacha, idiyas atzmacha. Oh, that's the same idea.
It's a similar idea, but the way he describes das is that you have a higher your intelligence, your neshama really is determining your behavior, not your Yetzer Hara, your impulses, and the way he quotes Rabbi Yerucham that the way you do that is that you train yourself to reject your whims and your petty impulses.
I think his background is really interesting. Ari, you mentioned that he came from a more secular background or less observant background, whatever that exactly means. We'll leave that for the biography that hopefully is coming out sometime. But anyway, I'm sure we'll not mention that. But how do you think his childhood impacted how he saw the world or how he evaluated the world from rabbi?
I don't know. Yaakov probably can answer this much better than I can. He's done significantly more reading into my grandfather's logs and books and writings and diaries than I did. But I think it's remarkable how normal he was coming from the background that he came from. He didn't grow up in a yeshiva world. Mm-hmm. He immersed himself in that yeshiva world when he went to the Mir and completely took it over. He absorbed it 100%. And that became who he was. So, whatever he grew up with and the whatever, let's call it, quote, baggage he had growing up, that was out,
I'd push back on that a little bit. Rabbi Rucham was very dedicated towards his development as a student. And he's German, grew up in Berlin, but not just, he didn't just live there. He was German in character. He's very precise and very meticulous and very thought out and, an engineer kind of mind. And very Yekish, as we would say. Very precise. And first of all, the cute story is that my grandfather was once davening with Rabbi Rucham. I think that has different minyan or whatever. And he closed his eyes to daven. And then I told you the story. And then he opened up his eyes in the middle of davening and he sees 8 inches from his nose is Rabbi Rucham staring at him. Can you imagine how terrifying that is? Staring at him because he's really trying to study him. He's a real pedagogue. He's really trying to study and understand him. But there was a story when my grandfather arrived to Yeshiva to the Mir. Rabbi Rucham was having a conversation with some of the more senior students about what do we do with this new project, this new Shlomo / Wilhelm. His father named him Wilhelm after the Kaiser, most likely. His name was Wilhelm. All the Germans had secular names. So his name was Wilhelm. Shlomo was his Jewish name, but he was known as Wilhelm. What do we do with him? How do we figure out how to build him? So the guys all said, you have to, his Yekishkeit, his German character trait is just too much. You have to rip that down. And he says, no, you have to build him on it. You have to take that and use that to build, so to speak, his spiritual edifice. And I think if you look at at the legacy that he built, you see a lot. Of course, any of the heresy, so to speak, that he was exposed to, he completely repudiated, including psychology. He started off as being much more receptive to secular psychology, and then he made a complete 180. There was a little noise there. I'll repeat that. And then he made a complete 180 where he completely repudiated it.
When was that?
I have a letter where he writes, he details his change and shows how secular psychology is really against Torah. So he does change. He does talk about psychiatry.
Are we talking as like in the 70s and the 80s?
I don't know. I don't want to. I think it was probably in the 70s or 80s.
It was deep into his from life. It wasn't like it's something that really he worked on and thought about and years of reflection.
Yes,
and came to that conclusion.
Yes, he came to the conclusion that Chazal are the best at this in human psychology, and the secular psychology is corrupt and it's wrong. That's the conclusion he arrived at.
You and I started an essay about
psychiatry.
Yeah.
Psychiatry and religion. Yeah, it's an amazing essay.
So was that before?
No, I think that he stood by. Psychiatry versus psychology.
Oh, got it. Okay.
But if you look at his Torah, at his persona, at his legacy, at his voluminous writings, you do see, I think, some of the fingerprints of his upbringing. His father was an academic. His father was a linguist. His father was a writer, which are, traits that you associate a lot with kind of, the German stereotype, thought out, history and, thinking about things, but being very precise, language. You see that in his writing. The language in his writing is just masterful. His command of language. He himself, he wrote books in Swedish because he was in Sweden during the war. He wrote a book in Swedish. Like he has a command of the language. He adopted it. Command of language, to such an extent that he was able to actually write a full-length book in Swedish. But in general, I think his Torah was very brilliant. It wasn't so much the kind of traditional mussar that we think of as where people just say things that feel good, and it was all based upon Chazal and building an entire treatise, starting from the bottom and building up until you create this incredible picture, incredible portrait. That is to me a little bit more of a kind of an academic. A brilliant academic way to portray Torah. So I think that yes, he did repudiate a lot of the German, the German upbringing to a certain extent, anything that was not Torah. And he did not go with the opinion of Rav Hirsch. He was not, even though they had the same birthday, which is maybe of note. But he did not go with the opinion of Torah Derech Eretz. He didn't believe in that, and he actually pushed back against people that he didn't think that was the right way to go. But I think you look at his unique persona and his unique personality and his unique contributions and his unique way of approaching problems. I think you do see still some of the good parts, if you will, of his German upbringing.
As you were describing that, I was thinking about Reuven Leichter, the Mashgiach, who I think was one of the major Talmidim of Mashgiach. And he also has a very creative approach and a very unique, and I think he has an interesting background too. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but
very similar to my grandfather.
Interesting, right? And he
Swiss,
but also was a Baal Tshuva.
Mm-hmm.
Who didn't, that creative thinking, that willingness to rethink something, which is what it takes to become a Baal Tshuva, right? You have to be open to rethinking things you thought you knew, and live with those conclusions. I think is very much part of that, which makes me ask you, who do you think is continuing his legacy most? I mean, outside of the family, I don't want to make this uncomfortable for you, but are there any particular people who you feel really were star Talmidim, so to speak, who you would look to discuss what he might have thought or his mission?
I think probably Rav Leichter and Rav Uri Weisblum. Rav Uri Weisblum is the Mashgiach in Nachlas Halavim in Haifa.
Oh, wow.
Americans don't know who he is. He's on the
Me'atzis.
He's on the Me'atzis. So get a sense of the
he's
kind of caliber.
Mashgiach there? Or
He's Mashgiach.
Does he write Svarim?
He does.
What do they call it?
Ha'aras, Hatfila, Ha'aras, a bunch of Ha'aras stuff.
Ha'aras Haderech.
Ha'aras, lots of Ha'aras. It starts, Aleph with an Aleph. Not a Ha'ara, like an insight.
Oh, like or.
Yeah, illumination. Yeah, the illumination of Tefillah, illumination of. Not available in English, sadly. But what I think it is unique about all the Bali Musar is that they all charted their own path. My grandfather was different than Baruchim's other Talmidim. People couldn't even believe that he would become the bearer of Rabbi Yeruchim's legacy, which he did become, because there were so many bigger Talmidim, in his time. But you look at Yeruchim's Talmidim, and Reb Nachum Pertzovich, or Reb David Pavarsky, or Blade Malin, these, or Chaim Shmulevitz, these are all Gaonei Olam, giants, and they're all Talmidim of Rabbi Yeruchim to a certain extent, and they each kind of built their own way. And my grandfather did the same personally, but also with his Talmidim. Uri Weisblum, aforementioned, and Rav Leichter are very different.
Very different.
They're very different, and that's a good thing.
So maybe there wasn't a mold where he said you're going to fit into this mold, and anybody who sees him says, "Oh, that's it." Each one is uniquely different.
And that's chinuch, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has to be different.
It's really interesting because I'm reading a Musar Sefer now that's somewhat historical, and it was contrasting Kelm and Slobodka, and that was one of the key characteristics that it contrasts. That Kelm did have a more identifiable tzura, and Slobodka Dafka didn't.
Yeah.
So, it sounds like your grandfather was really a Talmud of both, or he was more of a Kelmer, but yet he took on this aspect was more Slobodka.
Well, I think that certainly he would attribute his Mahalach more to Rabbi Yeruchim than anyone else. And the idea of creating a certain generic kind of Talmud was completely anathema to him. And if anyone's just doing things because everyone else does it, going with the flow, just being the same, and not really developing their own creative personality and their own
relationship with Hashem,
and relationship with Hashem, like that to him would be totally intolerable, because that's the antithesis of chinuch. It's antithesis of chinuch. To just be generic in any way. He used to like quoting the Chazal, Talmid Chacham Shemeis is irreplaceable. The Gemara says you cannot replace. Ein tmurasa, even though that's not really the lashon of the Gemara, but there's no tmura, there's no replacement. Everyone else to be replaced. A real Talmid Chacham is someone who is so unique, they're not replaceable, because there is no parallel. So the idea of finding a certain mold, and this is our type, that is definitely against the vision of my grandfather. Who is upholding the legacy? Listen, I think he was really worried that Musar is dying. He was really, really, really worried about that. In his tzava, in his last will and testament, much of it is dedicated towards the perpetuation of the Beis HaMusar and to announce by the Levi that the Beis HaMusar will continue. And he would really, really lament the fact that Musar is dying. And it's sad because, like we said earlier, there's just, generations of kids being born and being raised without chinuch. And that is a disaster.
Is Musar and chinuch the same thing?
I think so. It's a certain kind of, it is a form of chinuch. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, yeshivas have Musar seders. The modern yeshivas have.
He differentiated between limud Musar and chachmas Musar.
Okay.
And avodas Musar.
He said that, yes, thankfully, he wrote this, thankfully, the perfunctory, check the box, Musar Seder is still present in most yeshivas, not all, but most.
Which, by the way, hold on, but not in Kollel, which is interesting. Continue.
But the chachmas Musar, the avodas Musar, the actually application layer of Musar is sadly kind of going extinct.
Mm. Do you find yourselves trying to fulfill that in your own lives and your own avodas Hashem?
I do. I try to.
Like to really harken back to the Musar that your grandfather was talking about?
Look, I make a tremendous effort to learn my grandfather's Torah as much as I can because it brings me back into that realm. It brings me back into that, making a kviyos for Musar every day. Making a kviyos of like learning what my grandfather says at the Yisayis that every Ben Torah needs to learn and have a grasp on. So definitely, to me, it's, obviously there are things that always need chizuk, but to try to live up to that expectation is definitely something in the forefront.
I feel very guilty that I don't learn Musar B'Esbailas the way Yisrael.
What does that mean?
That was the chiddush of the insight of Rabbi Yisrael is not just limud Musar, it's Musar B'Esbailas, which is
like an indoctrination.
No, it's more than that. It's not indoctrination. No, it's a form of really self-hypnosis where you take. He told you how to learn Musar. So your lips are aflame, B'Esbailas with a certain, I don't know how to translate B'Esbailas.
Inspiration?
Excitement.
Yeah, it's a certain excitement.
An energy.
You take a citation of Musar and you think about it and you understand it and you read it and then you sing it and you repeat it again and again until it just enters your bones and changes you forever. That was his system.
It's funny because I'm reading the Sefer that I mentioned to you and it talks about that a little and the hours that were spent on that. And my initial reaction was, what bittul Torah? Like, think about Gedolei Olam spending an hour or 2 hours on a mantra.
Listen, we know with the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was definitely a proponent of this. First of all, he wrote it in Mishabur. But there are stories.
He writes about what?
About learning a half-hour Musar a day.
Really?
First page.
Of course.
But he would do it. There are testimonies of people hearing him saying again and again and again and again. A certain, I forgot what I think it was. Don't quote me here. I think it was Stagbush Dvarim.
You're quoting yourself.
Damayin Basa, and he would say it again and again and again and again and again.
Who's this, your grandfather?
No, the
Chafetz
Chaim. So, but I do feel, I like to your point, I do feel guilty because I know how powerful it is. Like
really,
the absolute people that put all the psychologists, Jung and Freud and all of them to shame are the masters of Musar, are Rabbi Yisrael, are the Alter, any version of one of them you want. And they said this is the way to do it.
If one of our listeners wants to learn more about that, how would they access that?
Rabbi Yisrael says, if you want to change without Musar is like seeing without an eyeball. It's like hearing without ears. That's the words that he says. Wow. It's not possible. Not possible. And again, he outlined the way to do it, and it works. You look at the Bali Musar, and they're princes of humans. Princes.
So where is this outlined? I mean, or in the Sefer Yisrael?
Of course, yeah. And you can find
my grandfather has a whole hadracha l'limud Musar.
Yeah.
Is that Chelik Aleph?
Chelik
Beis, yeah.
Interesting.
So I do feel guilty. And I know that this is how you actually change. This is it. I do, like my brother says, I do really, really try to learn my grandfather's Torah a lot, and I try to perpetuate it in in my classes, in my podcast. By the way, can I make a shout out for my podcast?
Of course.
So all the listeners to the Chinuch Today podcast.
It's only $1,000. Go ahead. Help yourself.
If you like what we have to say here, both my brother and I are proud hosts of a bevy of podcasts. Just put in Wolbe.
A bevy?
Bevy.
A bevy.
A slew of podcasts.
I think between the two of us, we have 11 podcasts. Huh?
A lot.
Wow.
A lot. Thousands of
That's
episodes.
weekly, for the record, or monthly.
So you could just put in Wolbe or whatever you whatever.
Yes, I must say that Yaakov Wolbe was a mentor of mine in the podcast area, and fast fact, he named the Chinuch Today podcast, Chinuch Today. That's right.
That's why I get a free shout out without paying
That's right.
$1,000.
Okay. We'll credit you.
But in my work, I always try to. We had a discussion earlier about chinuch. We had a nice spirited debate that was not recorded. Maybe for our next episode, if I get invited back, if I'm not blacklisted. But I did say that my grandfather says something, and to me that's authoritative. If he says it, that's it. To me, that's halakha mashma sinai. So I do try to learn my grandfather's Torah, perpetuate it in any way that I can. But I do. You hit a sore point that I really do feel guilty that even though I do learn Musar, and I do learn my grandfather's Torah, and I do try to perpetuate it. The Musar b'Hispailus, which is the actual Musar.
Space of mind. Is that an expression?
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of, you have to have space for it, right? You have to have time. It has to be quiet. Who has an hour and a half of time to
half hour a day.
Okay.
Listen, you look at any one of the giant, the Ramchal says that you have to, the Gemara says that you have to do cheshbon nefesh.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Gemara. It's not some new age Musar
some
thing.
Wolbeism.
Yeah, it's the Gemara. The Gemara says that the people that are the ones that actually change are the ones who do a cheshbon nefesh. Al kain yomru hamoshlim bo cheshbon. Who's the moshel b'yitzro? Who's the one who controls their yetzer hara, which is all we're trying to do. It's those who said bo cheshbon, bo nachresh bo shalom. Let's make a cheshbon nefesh. And Ramchal writes derech Eitz Chaim that it's the most valuable of uses of your time. And he says you should do it, ready, a minimum of an hour a day.
Right.
So if it's the best use of your time.
How many people alive today are doing that? What do you think? An hour of Hispailus a day?
Well, this is just for clarification. Rabbi Yisrael says do a half hour of Musar b'Hispailus every day. Ramchal says an hour of cheshbon nefesh, a minimum of an hour of cheshbon nefesh every single day.
Which, by the way, Breslov says as well.
Yes.
An hour?
Yes. Even though I think it might be a little bit different. The
work.
The method.
Yeah.
The method is different, but definitely.
Okay.
So maybe the last ones that were doing it is
It's Breslov.
Let's take a moment and talk about Mrs. Wolbe, the Mashgiach's wife. I know she was the daughter of, as you mentioned, the great Taras Avram Guzensky. I don't know much more about her or what she brought to the relationship and the experience. I thought maybe that would be of interest.
I was very close with my grandmother. She was a very, very special lady. And it's hard. I've never been able to put words to our relationship. We just had a certain love that was it was just a joy. Every time I came to the house, it was a fun time we had together. We would laugh together. We would kibitz. We had a very, very close relationship. And she even at times when she was getting a little older and she needed medical oversight, and I was not an EMT at the time. So she taught me how to check her blood pressure, and I'd come every night and check her blood pressure. And she, we would laugh. She'd call me Dr. Wolbe, and it was a real. We just had a great time together. She was a very, very special woman. She'd go learn Mishnayos every day with. They had this women's club in Givat Shaul where the women would learn Mishnayos together, and they would. She would. Yeah, it was like.
What Mishnayos they were?
I don't know, but she was in, aside for Tehillim groups and all the other things that, she was involved with. But she was, every Friday, there was a bag filled with cakes for all of the grandchildren. Every grandchild came to visit. Yeah. Every grandchild would come to visit and they'd get their stock for the week.
Wow.
It was an incentive.
She came over. I know she was born in Slobodka, I guess. And how did she escaped before the war, or did she suffer during the war?
After the war.
She came after the war.
Yeah, well, she went through the horrors of the war, and she wrote a book about it, which I recommend everyone reading it. Faith in the Night, Ve'emunascha Balelos. So I would recommend that.
Published by Israel Bookshop?
Published. Just, I don't know. Google it. They just reprinted it. It's an amazing, amazing work. You have it. Okay, good. But I would say more about her. She was a great grandmother, great as in descriptive. But she had, first of all, she had a nobility to her. She had a nobility to her that was very uncommon. Very uncommon. Her father was like that as well. Father was like a Malach Hashem, but she had this nobility that's just hard to capture in words. She also had a strength of character, almost like a steely vise in a pleasant way, all with pleasantness. But what she endured in her life, we cannot even fathom. Her mother died when she was very young, and she was responsible for raising the whole family. Her father
was handicapped, but also he was consumed with the yeshiva.
Was he handicapped all the years?
Since he was a teenager.
What was his handicap?
He had his leg, he had to drag his leg.
Really?
Yeah. But he himself was just also a portrait of nobility. During the war, what she went through, and she always maintained this sense of august nobility that it's hard for us to fathom.
Regal.
Yeah, very, very regal. And we also know even after the war, I noticed for a fact, after the war, she came to Torat Yisrael. Well, it's a whole story. She ended up in Sweden. That's where she met my grandfather.
I believe in the back of that book, there are some writings about that.
Yes. They went to Torat Yisrael. My grandfather founded a yeshiva. What they had to endure during the early years of that yeshiva, unimaginable.
The poverty?
The grinding poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And this is after the war. In the Jewish and democratic, of course, state of Israel. She actually went through actual hunger, and no one knew about it. No one knew about it. She never allowed any of her own pain and suffering to filter out in any way, which is an incredible strength and tenacity and fortitude. My grandfather himself didn't even know what she was going through.
Wow.
How do I know that? Because I read the secret writings that I cannot share. But that's just, you asked about her. But yeah, she's very sweet. Very sweet.
I'm aware of it.
Very sweet and just.
Their relationship must have been
her
magical.
emunah, her faith.
They must have
her
treated
indomitable
each other.
spirit.
I could just picture them treating each other with such dignity and.
Unbelievable. She came from a very prestigious family.
Did she have any siblings that survived?
She was one of 8. 4 were killed and 4 survived. Giants, all of them giants. 3 sisters. One married my grandfather. One married Rabbi Kreisworth, the chief rabbi of Antwerp, and one married Rabbi Rosenberg, who was the Yeshiva of Slobodka. Like all titanic Talmid Chachamim.
Wow.
And the brother that survived was the great Rabbi Yitzchak Grudzinski, one of the most special.
My Sandik.
That's right, one of the most special people. Really,
awesome.
well, someone you can't describe in words just how special of a person they were. And then 4 of them were killed. The 3 brothers, Eliezer, Velvel Zev, and Yisrael, and a sister Miriam.
Wow.
But of that family, I hate to say it, she was the greatest. She was the best. That's also documented.
Let's have that quoted. Wonderful. Okay, well, this was really so special. Just wondering if our listeners want to get started on Rav Wolbe after hearing this. They want to dig into.
We didn't even talk about Chinuch yet.
Right. That's the beauty. It's all Chinuch. Where would you want them to start? Where would you think a good starting place to get to know Rav Wolbe and his writings would be?
I'd say probably Zriya V'Binim B'Chinuch. Planting and building.
It's translated into English also, right?
It's a phenomenal piece of work. It's from 4 lectures that my grandfather gave. And I remember growing up, we used to have the cassettes that people would come and we'd have to find, part 1, 2, 3, 4, put them in a rubber band and bring them to the door. People would come to buy the series. But that eventually became into the Sefer. A very, very small Sefer, which I'm actually in the middle of teaching now to a whole group in Hebrew. And it's unbelievable.
Phenomenal. Yeah, I would second that. And just to bring it back to your earlier point, the whole major theme, the motif of the book, Zriya Binyan, that's an example of almost an academic way of portraying an idea, that we grow in two ways. Yeah, that there's a building growth and its limitations and its abilities and the different timelines that it has versus the planting and all that entails. So I would say if I could maybe add besides for that's the only one really that's available in English. They have an anthologized work on Chumash called Rav Wolbe on Chumash that was put out by our brother-in-law. Did a fantastic job. Volume 1, Volume 2. If you want to get a sense in some of the teachings on Chumash, if someone can read Hebrew, the literary contributions of my grandfather are so unique. Even Alei Shur, which is his magnum opus, right? Even the Haskamas that he got, they all write that this is a book we've never seen before. You can't describe it. It's a genre of book that there exists exactly one volume that fits into this genre. Well, really two, because Volume 1 and Volume 2.
I assume he worked really hard on that, and that was part of...
Very precise. Worked very hard.
Volume 1 took him 13 years. Volume 2 took him 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah. But we also have access to his manuscripts. And the amount of unpublished material, because there's lots of others from that.
I see they're coming out now with
the amount of unpublished writings exceeds the amount of published writings. So just very, very voluminous. And again, listen, his book that he wrote for our generation is Alei Shur. It's Alei Shur. Volume 1, it's really 4 different books that are merged together. But it's a form of hadracha. It's called Shari Hadracha. This is actual guidance. You want guidance. You want to be told, to be trained. It's about chinuch after all, right? This is training. It's training in 4 different stages of your life. Volume 1. Volume 2, I think it's a little bit easier. It's more user-friendly because he's not expecting as much from the reader as he is in Volume 1. In Volume 1, he's telling you stuff, but you kind of have to understand what he wants you to do on your own. In Volume 2, he spells it out for you. So it's a little bit easier to read. It's a little bit, it's a little bit of a less terse book. And again, the instruction layer is much more mifurat. It's much more spelled out, much more granular. But those are definitely, people here quoted every Yeshiva shul library has copies of it, and they are magisterial works, absolutely magisterial. So wonderful. I would recommend that as well.
Thank you, boys. Thank you both so much for this really enlightening conversation. I feel like we could go on and on. There's just so much there, and it's truly inspiring to learn about your grandfather and the impact he had on all of Klal Yisrael and on your families. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Garfield, for hosting us. I hope you have a lot of success with your Chinuch Today podcast, but also the chinuch that you provide for our community and our children. We're very fortunate to have you in our community to have your great skill and patience. I gather you may need some of that, but we really appreciate having you, and thank you for having us on the podcast.
My pleasure.
I second that. Thank you.